That is the act of reframing, which is it kind of empowers the individual to say, well, I can see that you frame the information up this way, or I'm even seeing it in a negative light, but I can actually turn it around, make it a positive, grow from it. In this discussion, we're going to examine framing, the framing of information, because whenever information comes our way, it rarely comes in a raw form of an input. There's a context to it. Something happened before, something will happen after. There's often an emotional reaction. There's often something we need to do with the information. And particularly around politics, there is framing everywhere. I'll begin with just sharing a story of art in frames. So I had seen the Mona Lisa at the Louvre about 5 years ago, and the experience of it was heavily dependent on the framing. The framing in the sense that it's presented in a large open air section in the museum, or at least when I had seen it. And what you're surrounded by is a crowd of about 25 other people who all have their phone out. So you almost get this odd experience of you're seeing this iconic artwork, the actual painting, but you're distracted by the fact that you're seeing little digital copies in the people in front of you's phones. And there's this very odd social component, which makes the whole experience so different, because it's kind of like mixing old with modern. And I just recently got to see the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti, which is presented in Germany, in Berlin, and it was very, very different. In that case, Nefertiti's bust is in a private room off on its own. It's very quiet, and you're not allowed to get your phone out. They have an usher who actually stops you if you get your phone out. And so you have the experience of being with this iconic artwork that you already know every detail of because we've all seen it so many times, but the context is very different. It's a very reflective context in that case. So not to say either is more or less interesting. I highly encourage everyone to see both of those in person and come away with your own experiences. But the framing matters so much. The context around the idea matters a great deal as to how we interpret it.
I think one touch point to politics and media here is to keep in mind that what we're really after, what we think we're after, is objectivity, right? That sort of God's eye point of view, the indisputable, unvarnished truth. This is how something is. But what we can't escape is the fact that we always have a perspective on something. We always have a certain interest, a vested interest in a certain outcome. We have certain needs and desires that are unique to ourselves that kind of impact the way a certain perceptual event occurs, right? And just speaking about framing effects in general, just to kind of get our heads in the right space here to make sense of this, one of my favorite examples is the way advertising works. So typically, if there's some sort of unwelcome information, something that if we were to see it presented in a certain light would make us feel less likely to be a consumer of that product, it oftentimes is spun in a certain way or framed in a way where it seems much more salutary, it seems much more encouraging, right, or positive. Like for instance, you look at like an ice cream, the way it's, instead of saying, oh, well, this ice cream is 30% fat, they might say, oh, it's 70% fat free, right? So really trying to put up in a neon sign the aspect of this, or a way of viewing the information that's going to make it much more likely you're going to really reach out that hand and grab that thing off the shelf. And spin doctors and consultants and politics and politicians are abundantly aware of this. In some ways, it's part of how campaigns are run, is how do we frame things in a way so that our side is as attractive as possible and the other side is as noxious as possible.
Yes, and this goes to the science of framing. There's a lot of work over the past 45 years, particularly on what's known as the framing effect. And the classic examples of it have to do with loss versus gains. When you take financial gambles, you're offered a sure amount of money, or you're offered a chance to gamble with the option of losing some percentage of the money. People gravitate toward the safe, sure option. They migrate away from the gamble when they are. Might have said that wrong.
No, you got this. You're on the right track here, Dan. The whole idea is like either I can give you the for sure gaining of money. Like here, I'm going to give you $20. And they're much more likely to take the sure bet, like the risk averse.
Yes.
And on the other hand, if I say, well, you might, here, I'm going to take, let's say the total amount of money you started with, just so it makes sense to us, it was $50. So I can tell you you're going to keep 20, or I can tell you you're going to lose 30. Same situation, right? I'm either highlighting the fact that you're going to lose the money and have a certain remainder, or I'm going to tell you the remainder you're going to have without telling you how that happened. How was the sausage made? Well, I had to lose 30 to keep 20. But if you highlight that fact, they're much more likely, I'm going to just go ahead and gamble instead. Right?
Yeah, people seek the risk to avoid the loss is really the essence of this work. And this is Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky famously published on this. A paper from 1981 comes to mind that is constantly cited when framing effects come up. But they do come up all the time in our political lives as well. It's exactly what we call spin, right? A political strategist has a newsfeed that's coming in. This particular thing has happened. Let's put a spin on it. Let's put a spin on that helps our candidate, that helps our party, right? And then it's going to be framed up as, guess whose fault it is? Those other guys. We're trying to fix the problem. And the reverse is happening in the other camp. They've taken the events and culled what they can out of it that suits their narrative, and they're going to frame it up in reverse. And we've done a discussion on news diet and the importance of trying to sample diversely, particularly trying to find centrist media that does really serious journalism, because they're going to be much more minimal on the frame. They're like Nefertiti's bust, where you're making the reflective judgment, whereas slanted or propaganda type channels and media are going to present a very definitive, very partisan version of some event, and that's a little bit of a different exercise. So we have terms for this just in society. Avoiding spin has everything to do with trying to get to the root cause of the events, doing the actual reasoning, which is typically messy. So we've talked about this before as fluid reasoning versus crystallized reasoning. Crystallized reasoning is when the general knowledge of the world that you have is left to react and fit events on the ground to what you already knew. And framing, particularly partisan framing, can make that resonate very easily. So the intake of news takes almost no work. It's just, oh yeah, those other guys are terrible yet again, and my guys are good yet again. Nothing really to think about. So often when we are in what we're seeking and what we encourage you to seek is the fluid reasoning state, which is a little klutzy and a little messy and a little reflective. It takes more time, but it's seeking to ignore the framing and really look at the substance of the information coming in. And that's a bit of a different exercise. It's not efficient, and it takes cognitive work. And so you're doing it properly. If you feel the gears within your head kind of turning a little slower, you're probably ignoring the framing and getting more to the substance.
It's true. In fact, this is sort of the hallmark of fluid reasoning at its best. Is it really does feel like a mental workout. It feels effortful. If someone any of our viewers who can relate to this, who've been in athletic pursuits, whenever you're engaged at the very fringe of what you're capable of physically, it's not a pleasant experience. Like if you're trying to get a personal best on a bench press, it's not a pleasant experience. It feels very effortful. You can't wait for that last rep where you can just hoist that weight back where it belongs, off of your arms, right? And that mental effort is very much similar in some ways. You feel like you're really spinning the wheels to be able to adopt multiple different perspectives, to see different ways of, see how the information lands on you in different ways, right? When you change the weightings. And one of the dangers of just accepting the frame up front without engaging in that sort of mental narrative rotation is that we wind up setting up false dichotomies in the world. We think the world is very categorical. It's left or right. It's right or wrong. And there's no gradations. Oftentimes, framing effect is very much built up with dichotomies, one frame versus another. It's rather than gradations. Instead of having 30 frames for the loss aversion examples from Kahneman's research, it's just one or the other, right? It's a loss or a gain. And this oftentimes puts us in this zero-sum thinking about the world. Oh, you win or I win. And that's the way politics oftentimes conducted, not just by those who are on the side of trying to run campaigns, the managerial aspects of this, but even as voters, we take this for granted, that if the other side has won the race, then we feel like we've suffered some sort of grievous loss here. And it does take some effort to see how there might be sort of knock-on effects or unintended consequences to even our own side winning that aren't always for the best. It takes some humility to admit that no one group, no one individual has a complete monopoly on the truth or has that much sought after utopian idea of the God's eye point of view and has the oracle-like understanding of how the world is really managed. No one individual really is capable of that. And it takes some humility for ourselves and for whoever we admire as being our sources of information to accept that.
That's right. And it feels as if we're being tricked some of the time with framing. When people start to read about framing effects or political spin or advertising methods where, the overemphasis on either the positive for the position you favor or overemphasizing the negative starts to feel like trickery. And to get a little bit deeper into the science behind this, emotion has everything to do with framing effects. So some work that I had done with a colleague of mine, Kevin Murch, was examining what we call attribute framing effects. And so it was just remarkable how this experiment worked. We would give people statements such as, I am honest at least 80% of the time. And they would just agree or disagree, and they would agree very reflexively that they are indeed honest 80% of the time. Later in the experiment, they would see the reverse frame. I am not honest at most 20% of the time. Think about that. That's exactly the same information, and people would reflexively disagree. No, I'm honest. And they ignored the numbers entirely. And this went on for, a half hour of these vignettes, and you would still see people showing the framing effect, meaning they're treating the same information differently depending on the frames deep into the experiment. Similar things have been shown with financial framing effects. I'm reminded of Scott Hutel's lab out of Duke that's done some work identifying the brain correlates of framing. And when you go with frame, when you say pick the sort of the sure gain option, or you reflexively gamble and take chances to avoid a loss, it's the amygdala and what we call the default mode network activating. The amygdala, of course, is very fast, reactive emotion. The default mode tends to be a set of brain networks that are active kind of with in relation to consciousness. By contrast, if you're able to reverse it, if you're able to actually overcome the framing and stick with the real information, you're choosing to gamble when there's a gain frame or just accept the loss when there's a loss frame, that's not the comfortable state of the brain. You see what's called the task network. A lot of frontal and parietal cortex gets activated in association with fluid reasoning. The same network is characteristic of our fluid reasoning, which we've been talking about as the remedy here. So again, amygdala in default mode happens for free, happens automatically. And so we're led very effortlessly by the framing, whereas doing the work and having that frontal activity is the slower response, the more thoughtful response, and it's effortful.
It's true, and it's about being strategic with our cognitive resources. There's also a extensive literature showing that by default, we are cognitive misers. We don't expend our cognitive resources frivolously unless we feel there's a reason, there's a cost to not doing so. And in this case, if we monitor in real time in conversation, when we're consuming information, that there is genuinely a cost worth taking seriously to just going with frame all the time. In this case, we're really cutting ourselves off from learning experiences, from being able to have fruitful, positive relationships with those who don't share our perspective. And instead of seeing them as just being wrong, just because they don't share our frame, they don't share the same perspective we have, but instead seeing their perspective as just being one of many, one of many angles with which one could see the Nefertiti's bust, as it were, right? One standing at the other end of the room saying, well, what does that angle look like to you? As opposed to saying, well, one of us has the best angle, right? So, well, you're able to appreciate more sides of the issue if you're able to go through the effort of going against frame, looking at multiple journalistic perspectives on the same issue, not necessarily to think that, well, I'm going to find the one correct perspective, but instead, but through aggregation, I'm able to interpolate. I'm able to kind of see where there's gaps across these different interpretations. Well, by a sort of like a principle of subtraction, what do they all agree on? What do they all say is beyond some sort of reasonable doubt? And that gives you something approximating objectivity or confidence in the assertions being made. But where you see there's like a lone voice making one claim, sure, there are whistleblowers, there are contrarian voices occasionally get things right, but oftentimes it's something to keep in mind. The credence we attach to it, whatever that modifier is, or that coefficient of confidence we attach to it, can be sufficiently moderated. Keep in mind, oh, that's just one perspective, one individual saying this. And that can allow us to, instead of treating statements as just being right or wrong, we have gradations of confidence in the statements being made by ourselves and the utterances we encounter from those around us.
It's almost like the Necker cube illusion, where you can see it from one or a different perspective, or the face vase illusion works this way, and you can kind of flip back and forth. You can do that same thing with ideas by sort of looking at it with one framing and then imagining it from a different framing. And that exercise breaks the illusion in a sense, because you begin to realize, well, there isn't just one way to see it. It's just our brain will lock in on the one way if we're kind of in that miserly mode. If we're sort of saving our deep thinking for later, we might fall into the perspective of just, yep, I understand exactly what happened there. I'm just going to take this news article I just saw on my phone at face value and not dig any further. Yep, the bad guys are still bad guys. I know that. All's right with the world. I can put this away and do something else. And I think in my own life, when I've gotten really emotional about our politics, it tends to be at night. Like I've noticed, like I can think of times where I would just get really distraught and like almost to the point of like risking losing sleep because I had been looking at news right before bed, and that's a time where your system is shutting down in a sense, like your circadian rhythm is telling you to go to sleep. It's not a really great time to try to digest the complexities of American politics or even current events. So you might even try to take a strategy where you kind of only look at news from multiple sources at certain times of day when you're a little more cognitively robust and willing to go to the effort to sort of really get to the bottom of what you think happened.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said here even for extremism and where that comes from, and with an eye towards framing and what that does to us. Is it does give us this very one-dimensional view of the world, a very simplistic view of the world. I'm reminded of a really pivotal moment from a conference I attended a few years back, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. And they have different symposia and discussions centered on topics that concern social cognition, and they also had political psychology sessions as well. And there was one on extremism and conspiratorial thinking and politics. And I think the antithesis to framing, that sort of dichotomized thinking, is to have more of a nebulous, nebulous view of the world, where you look at the true interpretation of things as being multi-layered, multifaceted. In some ways, it greatly outstrips whatever it is our cognitive resources are capable of doing. Like when it comes to the Necker cube example, you can't really see both perspectives simultaneously, and that is a function of our cognitive systems and the way it's built. And I remember during the session, I asked a question of one of the speakers whose name I've since forgotten, unfortunately, but I asked her if you could name like one cognitive variable that can explain conspiratorial thinking and extremes more than any other, what really comes to mind here? And what she said is, it's a need for closure, a need for cognitive closure, for that black and white thinking, for dichotomies, that simplistic world. Because it's a simplistic world of yes versus no, good and evil, right and wrong that allows us to engage in behavior, engage in action. But on the other end of the continuum, or the perception action cycle our brains are manufactured for, where our brains, it bears re-mentioning from a previous episode where we discussed this, our brains are information transmuting devices that take in perceptual events in the world, things we hear and sense and touch and so on, and we use that in the alchemy of our cognitive systems to produce actions, meaningful actions for avoiding threats and for approaching resources and things that our bodies need to continue existing. But in the interim, we have this ability to reflect. We have the fluid reasoning process. And wherever there's no dichotomies of the right answer and the wrong answer, there's this world of trying to find our bearings. And that's this, and now there's a term of paralysis by analysis, when we have so many options. And this is one of the challenges, right? It's because it feels like it's not productive in some ways, because it feels so effortful. There isn't like this landing point of, oh, this is the course of action, let's proceed. That's just the opposite of what a lot of political consultants are hoping to elicit from our behavior as voters. They want you to have a final judgment of, yes, vote for this person, not that person. Donate to this campaign, not that campaign. And volunteer for this campaign, not another. As opposed to getting us to spin our wheels, to engage in a very reflective exercise. That's where we as citizens need to take the initiative and empower ourselves to engage in that reflective action that is very much the opposite, the antithesis of the framing mindset.
That's right. And the idea of these precursors, the need for closure being one of those. Also, tolerance to ambiguity is another term, which is something that can be measured. And it's just one's willingness to grapple with an unclear situation and can sit longer with the information. So if you have a high tolerance to ambiguity, probably have a lower sense of a need for closure. You're just sort of willing to sit with an open question for a little bit longer. And this all sounds very nefarious, that why do politicians and political strategists do this? Why do they have to be so dishonest? Why do advertisers have to try to trick us with their clever, selective framing of things? And I would say, that we all do this. We're all in the business of framing information. It's just when we discuss something, we want to get to the point. We want to make the salient point obvious. And there's a way of speaking in a compelling manner where you're not circumlocuting all over and just thinking aloud. It's very hard to listen to that. And we probably are guilty of it sometimes in these discussions. But really getting to the point can be accompanied by a framing. And that's actually a good thing. It's good teaching is about framing the information in a way that the consumer is prepared to assimilate it and understand it. So we're always framing something. It's not like we can choose to not do it. It's just how we do it. And it's also a very valuable tool psychologically. So there's a term called reframing emotional events. And this happens in counseling a lot. And it also just happens in kind of pop psychology. It's just general life advice is to try to see the positive. And that's a framing that one can seek, right? So the exercise of looking for, is there another side to the Necker cube that I can seek? I'm reminded of the Monty Python song, always look on the bright side of life, and that there's value in that. You can always reframe it around, well, maybe something positive will come out of this pain I'm feeling right now, and I'm gaining experience, and I'm going to move forward. And that is the act of reframing, which is kind of empowers the individual to say, well, I can see that you frame the information up this way, or I'm even seeing it in a negative light, but I can actually turn it around, make it a positive, grow from it. And I think that reframing is maybe a good place to end this discussion, because that is a practical thing that has a lot of therapeutic value, has a lot of value for life, and we can all do it.
I think that is a good note in which to leave things here. This whole sense that there's a real cognitive training involved in reframing, going through that effort, getting those reps in of adopting multiple perspectives. It becomes more and more second nature for us the more and more we begin to do that reflexively. Paradoxically, the reflective action becomes more reflexive the more we do it. And that helps us to be much more adept at and being nimble with our ability to engage in conversations about multiple subjects with multiple perspectives. And that can only serve us well in that bridge building exercise as opposed to bridge burning, which is really the pathway of polarization and toxic tribalism. In our next episode, we're going to discuss, when it comes to our media diet, what are the pitfalls, the dangers of echo chambers and filter bubbles? How does that in turn kind of feed into extremism and to framing, in fact? But we do appreciate audience's attention in this episode, and feel free to leave a comment below and subscribe for more content from our channel.
Remember, everything's got a frame. We just have to seek the substance.
Yes.